In the old Buddhist story, a woman named Kisa Gotami had only one son. When he died suddenly, she was devastated, and quickly she did the only thing she could think to do. She swooped the boy up in her arms and ran to the door of the Buddha's house. Tearfully, in agony, she begged the Buddha to revive him. He had compassion for her, and he told her he would raise her son, but she had to do something first. She had to go into the village and acquire mustard seeds from a house in which no person had ever experienced the death of a loved one. She knocked on the first door she came to and asked her question, but no, they couldn't help. They had known someone who had died. They replied, "The living are few, but the dead are many." The second door was the same, and the third, and finally she understood that death touches everyone. And according to the story as recorded in the Buddhist scripture, she said, "It's not just a truth for one village or town, nor is it a truth for a single family. But for every world settled by gods and men, this is indeed what is true: impermanence." Maybe it seems strange to be discussing death and grief on this last Sunday of February, a month in which we've been talking about love. But grief, as the parable reminds us, touches all of us at one time or another. If we love, we will grieve, because impermanence is the human condition. We will surely never welcome the experience, but our love for those we hold dear continues past their death in the form of grief. In our culture, sometimes we turn grief into a pathology, a sort of mental or emotional deficiency to be overcome by handing someone a tissue quickly, or telling them not to cry, or by taking 5 days of bereavement leave. So let me say right off that there's nothing wrong with us when we're grieving, and that there are many healthy ways to express grief. It is okay to weep quietly, and it's okay to wail loudly, and it's okay for there to be no tears. It's healthy to cry, and it's healthy to laugh and tell stories. In some ways, every grief is as unique as the love that produces it. Still, there are some common traits, and I think it can help to understand something about what's going on in us when we grieve. Lots of people have tried to understand. Probably the most common lens through which we view grief is the 5 stages of grief developed by a medical doctor, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in the mid-20th century. Kubler-Ross interviewed dying patients and their families at the University of Chicago. And she observes the hospital there, and she observes some common features of their grief. Those common features she described, as you probably know, the 5 stages of grief. I like to add a caveat when I talk about Kubler-Ross. I think what she discovered is tremendously helpful in the effort to understand grief, but it tempts us in our sometimes very linear thinking society to see them as 5 stages we will move through sequentially. Which one am I on again? Checking each one off as we go until finally we move through the 5th stage and are on to new adventures. More likely, we will loop through the stages. We might have days in which we experience all of them. The loops may get wider and wider and wider. Still, I think her observations are helpful. So first, she noticed that a lot of patients grieve through denial. I experienced this some years ago with a hospital patient. Her 30-year-old daughter had been fighting cancer and doing well when she took a downturn. When doctors told the mother her daughter may not make it this time, the mother said, "I know you have to say that, but she's going to be fine. She has 2 sons, and she really wants to be there for them. She'll be okay." Denial can be powerful, a psychological coping tool. There's nothing wrong with denial. We sometimes want to push people through it. That doesn't work, I don't think. Nothing wrong with denial necessarily, especially when loss is new. The second stage that Kubler-Ross talked about was anger. Anger can be like trying to hit something a long way away with a garden hose. Often it isn't terribly focused, and it hits unintended targets. So doctors, nurses, family members who didn't tell the dying person soon enough or in the right way might be the focus. Anger can be directed at God. In fact, even those of us who aren't traditional theists may find ourselves angry at the universe itself or even a God we don't believe in. That's complicated. That's also okay. Anger is not a mathematical equation to be solved. It is likely to be part of the journey of grief for most of us. So denial and anger, and Kubler-Ross also observed the prevalence of bargaining in the grief process. I just need to finish raising my children. It's a common form of bargaining. If I could just get past this next life stage, I would be fine with dying. It can also take a sort of more outright form when dying persons and their families bargain with God for just a little more time. Fourth, and probably least surprising, Kubler-Ross noticed that a lot of patients move to a period of depression, patients and their families. In her book on death and dying, she described this phase this way. When the terminally ill patient can no longer deny their illness, when they're forced to undergo more surgery or hospitalization, when they begin to have more symptoms or become weaker and thinner, they can't smile it off anymore. Their numbness and stoicism, their anger and rage may soon be replaced with a sense of great loss. This also applies to the family and friends, as I said, of someone who's dying. Again, it's tempting to pathologize this, but it can be a natural part of the grief process. And finally, Kubler-Ross, her last stage, the last stage that she spoke about was acceptance. She calls this in dying patients the final rest before the long journey. The terminal patient has accepted her fate. She begins slowly to withdraw from friends and family. The circle becomes tighter and tighter. And death becomes in many ways a journey made either alone or with a few trusted companions. So grief moves through denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance, or it can. That is important wisdom, and for many of us it has guided our thinking about grief. But again, I would caution that grief does not move through those stages predictably. A favorite song or the smell of a particular food can trigger a new cycle of grief. Some people ask, how long does grief take? And the answer is always, it takes as long as it takes. And it's different for everyone. So I think her stages, Kubler-Ross's stages, become more useful when we combine them with another theorist, William Worden, and his notion that there are 4 tasks that the grieving person needs to accomplish. And the first, he says, is the acceptance of the reality that a death has in fact occurred or is about to occur. Working in the hospital years ago, I fielded requests and prepared the bodies for people who wanted to see their loved ones days after they died suddenly in the emergency room. They want to look again. They usually want to touch again in some unconscious way to make sure their loved one is dead. It is natural. Second, Worden says the grieving person must accept that death is painful. In other words, we must at some point stop refusing to face the pain. One author writing about Worden said, use of alcohol or drugs for avoidance of the feelings of anger or remorse or sadness, unnecessarily deep involvement with work or sex. These are some of the devices people use to avoid the pain of grieving. Busyness is another. No one can be forced to face pain, but Worden says this is one of the tasks we have to accomplish as we move through grief. So accept that it's real, that it's happening. And accept that pain is involved. And then Worden says the person needs to adjust to an environment that no longer includes the person who has died. How difficult this task is. The spouse returns home after their partner's died to discover it's now their job to do a lot of things the other person did. At the holidays, there's an empty chair at the table. There's a joke that might have been made that goes unspoken. Here is the task during which grieving people need companions who know how to be friends during grief. Most of us can be that kind of companion for our loved ones who are grieving. Ryan Engler wrote a poem about her grief entitled, "It's Going to Be Okay." She said, yes, we know that time will pass, days will go by, and so will months, and some way we will find ourselves in a different place several years from now, at a point when we can look back and reflect and say we made it through. But now I want to tell my story, to joy my friends' memories. But each time I do, they grow impatient. They don't want to go through it again because they don't understand its magnitude. It is irrelevant to them. All they know is that it's been 8 months. The clock is ticking, and it's time to move on. This is said in so many words, not the least of which are, it's going to be okay. Okay. To say that it's going to be okay, to imply that we could ever go back to what it was like before, is to take away the enormity of the loss. So here's her prescription. If you can give one thing to the bereaved, she said, it is time. Time without boundaries, without expectations, without preconceived notions of timelines or what is okay for the bereaved. Only we are capable of knowing what is okay for us at any given time, and even then we're not so sure. Don't mold us. Don't tell us how or what to feel. Ask us what we feel, and then wait around for the answer. That kind of companionship can be so valuable as people adjust to a new reality. Worden's last task for the grieving person is to, quote, be able to withdraw much of the emotional energy once invested in the dead person and begin to reinvest it in other relationships. This isn't about forgetting someone who's died. It isn't about even moving past them. In fact, some say the more healthy the relationship the grieving person had with the deceased, the more likely that last step is, the more quickly, rather, that last step is likely to happen. But grief can move us even to this place of replacing the energy in that relationship or shifting the energy in that relationship to another. The truth is, if we love, we will eventually grieve. A lost relationship, a lost loved one, but other transitions too. Loss of a job, sometimes the birth of a child, and the changes that brings. We will eventually grieve. It's one of the hard truths of the human experience, but a poem by Mary Oliver reminds us not to let the fear of loss cause us not to love. She writes, when death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering what is it going to be like, this cottage of darkness. And therefore I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending as all music does toward silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom, taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. That kind of life will lead us to grief. But I say, let a half-lived life not be our fate. Rather, let us love with abandon. And when we do experience loss and grief, may we have powerful memories and faithful companions along the journey. Amen.